Warfare takes many forms, but it is on the field of battle where legends are made. The greatest epics were not written about the dialogues of Socrates, the theses of Luther, the speeches of Washington, or the debates of Lincoln, but rather the risk and reward of war. The human blood shed for the sacrifice of family, nation, or individual pride. Mankind has always been at war. Since the original sin of Adam in the garden, humanity has quarreled with earth and nature, created conflicts with truth, but most of all, humanity has fought against itself. For millennia, war has cursed mankind as a whole, but some have found satisfaction, glory, and redemption in the shedding of blood. In either sense, war has been proved almost necessary in freeing a nation or keeping one liberated and safe from external dangers. From the ancient times to the modern, there has been a consistent flow of new innovations on the physical side of war, as nations attempt to wreak greater havoc on their enemies. This preoccupation has been pedestalized so heavily that it has now become known as the art of war. All great nations and empires participated in this art of war, violent and non-violent alike. One of the greatest war texts in history, written by Sun Tzu in the 5th century BC, reflects the same topic in its content and title. In The Art of War, Tzu demonstrates that strategies are the lifeblood of success. If his manual were to be applied to the last letter, any empire would be supremely equipped to succeed in battle, and any individual prepared well to fight equally dangerous intellectual or spiritual conflicts. As the art of war puts forth, and as historical warfare proves, weapons are the tools the tactics utilize. Therefore, the development of dominant strategies plays a far greater role in the assurance of victory than the focus on advancing lesser weaponry. War can be defined in the dictionary as a hostile, armed, and declared conflict between two or more opposing parties, inside one nation or involving multiple. General Karl von Clausewitz, in his 1832 novel Vom Krieg, or On War, simplifies the definition of war to a duel, but on a larger scale. It is, quote, an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. As concise as this definition may be, the physical art of war is much more complex. With this, there are two aspects of war, the visible and invisible. On the visible side, weapons are the primary source of attention and attract people to the physical impact of war. On the invisible side, however, there is a plethora of covert activities that control the physical art of war. This is the world of strategy, where the art of war is sustained and success is gained. It may seem obvious from a cursory glance into historical war that weapons make a greater impact on the outcome of a war. Although victory may be won with the physical weapons in the hands of the soldiers, it is the premeditation of tactics that wins a war as a whole. Weapons can only be useful when guided by well-constructed strategies. These strategies can be found in countless places, but arguably the greatest of all is The Art of War by Sun Tzu, the oldest military treatise in the world. Its discourse is almost entirely devoted to the development of strategies to be used in war, discussing hundreds of individual tactics. The composition focuses primarily on some of the most critical strategies in war. The first, deception, is highly effective in war when distracting or misleading an enemy, but is powerful and must be defended against as much as it is utilized. Timing is likewise useful and demands the attribute of patience to accomplish a mission in war at the proper time to save lives and resources. Similar to timing is the skill of haste, which is the art of deliberate productivity and efficiency, another important tactic that prevents the loss of resources and lives by fighting for too long a period. Preparation is the last of the primary skills of wartime, as by premeditating possible outcomes, a leader may counteract dangers and gain the upper hand. As time goes on, the skill of adaptability comes into play as well as weapons and strategies change, but Tzu's work is nevertheless relevant even to this day, no matter the type of warfare, physical, spiritual, or otherwise. Despite the fact that it was written over 2.5 millennia ago, The Art of War has become a timeless model that will never cease to be practical as a manual in and out of the battlefield. And it even has battle beyond the physical theater. It has value beyond the physical theater of war. During the same century as the writing of The Art of War, one of the greatest historical conflicts took place, called the Battle of Thermopylae. This battle was in 480 BC amidst the Persian Wars. A little while over a decade before Thermopylae, Persia had been unified into an expansionist empire under Cyrus the Great, then Darius I, then his successor, Xerxes I. Darius first began the conquest of the Greek city-states, attempting to defeat the Athenians and Spartans, demonstrating his empire's strength. The Greek historian Herodotus writes that, quote, they intended to subdue as many of the Greek cities as they could, unquote. Although Darius died before his objective was carried out, his son Xerxes adopted the same ambition and began to march a considerable force toward Greece. This force, made up of hundreds of thousands of Persian troops, pursued a much smaller force of only a few thousand Greeks, until the Spartan king Leonidas ordered the rest of the Greeks to flee to Athens so he could give them time, and with it, a fighting chance. The hundreds of thousands of Persian troops pursued the 300 Spartans and 1,000 other Greeks along the coast of the Greek main, in a chase that seemed as though it would only have one result, the destruction of the tiny Greek force. Because Leonidas and his men were so greatly outnumbered, they needed a perfect strategy to survive. So, the Spartan king led his army into the tall, narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, rendering the vast Persian numbers useless and giving the Spartans a fighting chance. For 2 long days, the Greeks held off the Persians and suffered very few losses themselves, while inflicting massive casualties upon the Persians. In the end, Leonidas and his men were finally defeated when a traitor among the non-Spartan Greeks revealed a hidden path through which the Persians sent troops to annihilate their enemies for good. Despite the loss, it was truly a masterful stroke of brilliance on the part of Leonidas, costing the Persians tens of thousands of lives and allowing the remaining Greeks to prepare for and win the next battle against the Persians in Salamis. Even in death, the art of war still held true for the Greeks. On the matter of sacrifice, Zeus writes this, quote, regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death, unquote. Through the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas demonstrated that even when an army is completely physically outmatched, properly developed tactics can reverse the outcome of a war in which defeat seemed inevitable. Far from and long after Thermopylae, another historical master of war utilized strategy to defeat a powerful enemy. This leader was Julius Caesar, and his target was Vercingetorix, the king of Gaul. During the 1st century BC, Caesar fought relentlessly, expanding the Roman Empire into the vast territory of Gaul, or what we know now as Western Europe. After nearly a decade of conflict, the Gallic Wars came to a close after one of the greatest conflicts in Roman history, known as the Battle of Alesia. The town of Alesia was home to the king of Gaul, Vercingetorix, and the only way that Caesar could conquer Gaul was through the elimination of their king. He believed that without their leader, Gaul would fall into his hands. As such an astute leader, Caesar had developed the skills of timing and preparation to conquer Alesia efficiently and without delay. This was unquestionably necessary, as Zeus sets forth in the Art of War. He writes that, quote, the rule is not to besiege walled cities if it can possibly be avoided, unquote. However, he also encourages the skill of adaptability, continuing with this, quote, move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. Fight not unless the position is critical, unquote. In Caesar's case, the siege was critical, and there was assuredly something to be gained in the elimination of Vercingetorix. By utilizing his resources and men effectively and quickly, Caesar constructed a ring of defense around Alesia to fight against the hundreds of thousands of Gauls in and outside of the city. In only 2 months, the city was completely isolated. Under the tactical leadership of Caesar, the Romans utilized counterattack strategies and the defenses that they had built, and were able to hold off the onslaught of Gauls, succeeding in the capture of Alesia and the elimination of Vercingetorix. In the dystopian novel 1984, George Orwell writes that, quote, nations that were not efficient in wartime were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions, unquote. Because of Caesar's efficiency, his nation would never be conquered while he was alive, and would only ever be expanded greatly. In the end, this siege was an act of brilliance and a perfectly executed strategy that ultimately succeeded in shattering the defense of Gaul and expanding the Roman territories far beyond it. Over a millennium after the stand of Thermopylae and the siege of Alesia, a new era had begun in what would now become known as the medieval years, and the art of war continued to hold true in applications of war. No empire who gained victory ever succeeded without following the precepts of Zeus. William the Conqueror of Normandy was no exception, and his conquest of England was a brilliant takeover of an entire empire, clearly reflective of his mastery in the art of war. In 1066, Edward the Confessor, the King of England, had died, passing his throne to Harold Godwinson. William, however, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years ago. Filled with desire for English power but remaining keen on strategy, William waited for the perfect moment to strike with all of his power and take it for his own. Finally, an opportunity arose when Harold Hardrada invaded England in the north with the same goal as William. There was a sharp contrast between the two men, however. Hardrada relied solely on the power of his physical army, aiming to wipe out the English forces and take the throne with brute force. William, on the other hand, waited patiently until Godwinson was distracted. By doing so, he followed a precept of Zoo on the matter. Quote, "So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak." Unquote. Harold Hardrada's invasion failed, and yet it left Harold Godwinson weak, distracted, and low on supplies of numbers. Right at this time, William struck with perfect timing and full force in the south. Despite his claim that he was promised the throne 15 years previous, William played his cards carefully and struck at the proper time of English weakness, succeeding in gaining power and making the Norman conquest one of the greatest usurpations in medieval history. Another precept of Zoo that William exemplified in his invasion was this, quote, "Attack him where he is unprepared, appear where you are not expected," unquote. William the Conqueror did exactly this, waiting and taking England over while its leader was completely unprepared. After landing in southern England, William marched his army through town after town after town, being careful not to destroy everything in his path, but only to defeat his opposing forces, desiring to keep the nation alive for his future control. This was yet another example of Zoo's writing manifested by William the Conqueror in the Norman conquest. Zoo writes that, quote, "In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good," unquote. This was a very wise decision on William's part, because following the decisive battle of Hastings, Harold Godwinson was ultimately defeated, earning William the throne and control over England. William the Conqueror dominated an entire empire in only a few months, demonstrating that through patience, subjugation, efficiency, timing, and other strategies, there is no limit for what can be achieved in war. Centuries after England was taken by William of Normandy, it had become the British Empire, in control of many territories around the globe. One in particular was a collection of 13 colonies in America. On the legendary day of July 4th, 1776, those 13 colonies would make history, eventually becoming one of the greatest and most powerful nations of all time. The claim of independence made on that day, on behalf of the nation that would become the great one we live in now, came at a cost. This included the sacrifice of tens of thousands of American colonists who suffered endlessly at the hands of the British and gave their lives in a war against tyranny. 1 year before the Day of Independence in 1776, the first revolutionary battles took place in the fields of Lexington and Concord. Poet and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his famous work titled The Concord Hymn, composed these words, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world." This shot would truly impact the globe, and the rumor spread that an incredibly minuscule group of ill-equipped farmers had taken it upon themselves to revolt against the dominant British Empire. This shot began the true American Revolution, changing the course of America forever. In every battle following Lexington and Concord, the colonists were hopelessly outnumbered but pushed on nevertheless. The thing that made the American Revolution so incredible was that the British military was at the time the greatest in the world, made up of intensely trained soldiers, vast resources, and tightly regimented military standards. The newly formed American militia, on the other hand, which was led by George Washington, had nothing of the sort except a sacrificial patriotism resembling that of the Spartans in ancient Greece. Led by George Washington and others, the militia began to develop tactics that counteracted the sharp standards of the British, and began to successfully dupe and outmaneuver their enemies, who were slowed by their organization and their lack of knowledge of the terrain. One of the greatest applications of American tactics was in the Battle of Bunker Hill. During the battle, the Americans positioned themselves atop Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, entrenching themselves above their enemies, gaining both a height advantage and protection from British artillery fire. As the British ranks advanced on their position, the colonists waited until the last moment before engaging, notably hearing the order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This enabled them to conserve every last bullet of their lacking arsenal, inflicting as much damage on the British as possible before their supplies were depleted, taking out far more British than they possibly could have in an open battlefield. George Washington understood the necessity that adapting was the only way to turn the tide of the war in their favor, and although the British were successful in taking the hill, they suffered so badly that from that point on, the war had been psychologically won in the hands of the American colonists. Their motivation only continued to grow after the famous crossing of the Delaware. in which Washington led a collection of soldiers on Christmas morning to eliminate the German troops known as the Hessians, who were hired by the British. Sacrificing comfort and relying on the expected human behavior of Christmas to distract their enemies, Washington crossed the vast, icy river in horrible weather conditions and was able to take over the Hessian garrison in the town of Trenton, New Jersey, taking 900 Hessians captive without the loss of a single life. Sun Tzu wrote to, quote, "Attack him where he is unprepared and appear where you were not expected," unquote. And this tactic by Washington led to such a great success that it would truly justify the sacrifice at Bunker Hill. The American Revolution was eventually a success for the colonists, and thus the nation of America was instituted. In retrospect, the failure of the British to adapt cost them the war. Although Tzu's work will never truly completely become inapplicable, as time changes, tactics must change as well, following the same precepts set forth in the art of war. This fact was recognized and put into practice by the colonial militia leaders, who learned to outplay the British fighting style using carefully developed tactics to defeat an enemy of vastly superior physical power, proving, yet again, that it is strategies, not weapons, that make a greater impact in warfare. One of the most dangerous and effective tools in the art of war is deception. When used properly, it becomes a tool of both saving lives and destroying them. The former use was carried out perfectly by the British during the Second World War. In the centuries after the American Revolution, they learned from their mistakes and learned to adapt, which was demonstrated through the execution of the plot known as Operation Mincemeat. Their Allied troops intended to deceive Hitler and the Axis powers that their next offensive was directed toward the Balkan islands of Greece and Sardinia. In reality, the Allies intended to invade the island of Sicily, a highly strategic position that they believed would turn the tide of the war in their favor. Ben McIntyre, author of the text Operation Mincemeat, wrote that, quote, "Sicily was the logical place from which to deliver the gut punch into what Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of the Axis," unquote. Sicily was the only possible path for the Allies to take into Europe to uproot the Axis powers from the source by weakening Italy on the way to Germany. Since it was such a powerful position, however, it was heavily guarded, and to invade it openly would be far too costly on the Allied numbers. The takeover of Sicily therefore became a massive operation, requiring the utmost attention to detail. Tzu writes on this topic, saying, quote, "When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack," unquote. With such an operation as this, the British created a secret operations unit called the 20 Committee, led by Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, to carry out their plan of deception through the piece of bad luck strategy, in which a feigned misfortune occurs that spreads false information. In this specific example, the misfortune was a drowned soldier carrying misleading documents, directing the reader to believe in a false operation. The possibilities for failure were so extensive that it would take nothing short of a perfect scheme to actually convince the Germans that the man and his documents were legitimate and believable. For months and months, as the plan was woven into existence, the massive gamble of deceiving the Axis powers began to seem more plausible. And at last, a recently passed man named Glyndor Michael was selected to fill the persona of Major William Martin, the contrived officer of the British Navy. As the date of Martin's drop into Spanish waters approached, the false Major Martin was equipped with all of his necessary belongings and identification papers, while the 20 Committee coordinated with many different connections in Spain and Germany to covertly ensure the transfer of documents without revealing the true intentions of the Allies. The body was at last taken by a submarine crew to be sent off. Their captain, Bill Jewell, said that, quote, "In wartime, any plan that saved lives was worth trying," unquote. Saving lives was indeed the goal. What began as an entirely unrealistic ruse would become a powerfully effective plan of deception, as the documents finally reached the hands of Hitler himself. As the Allies waited in earnest, knowing nothing, a few months later, the Allied invasion of Sicily began, and the 20 Committee held on to the dangerous hope that their ruse was successful, knowing that thousands of lives held in the balance. After waiting for what felt like an eternity, the secret team of 20 received a telegram from Winston Churchill himself saying this: "Mincemeat swallowed, rod, line, and sinker." The good tidings confirmed the success of Mincemeat, which would become one of the greatest successful deception plots in human history. The successful takeover of Sicily carried the Allies to victory in World War II, cementing Tzu's tactic of deception as one of the greatest methods by which a party defeats its enemies, no matter the superior numbers or physical dominance on the enemy's side. A perfect execution of tactics will always overcome a disparity in weaponry. One nation that failed to understand this was the United States during the Vietnam War, despite their previous flawless war record. During the mid-1900s, the U.S. had constructed a massive production industry and was therefore more equipped with weapons than any other nation in the world at that time. With this in mind, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, followed by Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, sent massive numbers of troops to Vietnam with the assumption that they could easily raise the rising communist movement known as the Viet Cong to the ground, replacing them with democratic leadership. This was a grave mistake, however, as the adaptability that was once demonstrated by American revolutionaries in 1776 had been significantly diminished over the centuries that America had grown more powerful. Sun Tzu writes on the topic of preparation and adaptability, saying, quote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt," unquote. American leadership had no such doubt in their own upcoming victory, but they did not know their enemy, which would cost the enemy much more than only their pride. The failure to adapt during the Vietnam War led the American troops to be perpetually outnumbered. They were not prepared to respond to guerrilla tactics in which the Viet Cong were extremely proficient. The hostile, unknown jungle and the unfamiliar territory to the Americans created constant weaknesses, costing the lives of over 60,000 American troops in the end. Even after such a great loss of life, the Vietnam War was a loss for the Americans, as we were forced to withdraw and South Vietnam surrendered to communist control. This war was a perfectly fitting example of the necessity to adapt, and just like the British in 1776, the United States lost a great war as a result of their failure in the skill of adaptability. In the modern day, war has the capability to be different than anything we have ever seen. The development of nuclear weapons has led to constant global tensions. Because if all of the most powerful we use, the entire global ecosystem would be disrupted so heavily that not a single human could survive the aftermath. The primary weapon in question is the thermonuclear bomb. The first version of this device was developed in the Second World War and used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two Japanese cities that had been completely untouched by previous hostilities, which perfectly demonstrated the disastrous capabilities of such weapons on civilization. You could argue that the Second World War ended with only two bombs, which may insinuate that no other tactics would ever be necessary in war. However, nuclear war on the highest level now is entirely out of the question. Since the atomic bombs were actually used, nuclear development has been pushed far beyond, and systems across the globe have been created to ensure the immediate knowledge of and response to the launch of a nuclear missile. Since the use of nuclear weapons promises global retaliation and destruction, it has been titled the Doctrine of Mutually Assured Destruction. This is why we pray that no global nuclear war will ever begin, because the use of any modern nuclear devices against another nation would elicit an equally destructive and unstoppable response. Though the dominant power of nuclear weapons is unquestionable, their existence is truly a strategy about demonstrating power and resources, and less of a weapon in itself, likely never to be utilized in a field of war, as once was done on Japan. If they were, the very human race could become extinct. To be fluent in the art of war is to make victory inevitable. This is the concept that Sun Tzu sets forth in the art of war. The greatest leaders in history, from Leonidas to Churchill, recognized the necessity of the invisible facet of war, the side in which deliberation determines fate. As demonstrated through recorded history, it is the creation and operation of strategies, not a physical upper hand, that contributes the most to success on the field of battle. Consider, however, that successes found in the application of the art of war are not exclusive to the shedding of blood. It is equally important to strategize in life. The human condition sparks many conflicts, and their solutions often require a strategic approach rather than a blunt one. Considering the successes of Leonidas, Julius Caesar, William the Conqueror, George Washington, and others, history has taught that pure reliance on brute force to solve problems and eliminate enemies often falls short. Although it may appear that the odds of life are stacked against us, or that fate is set contrary to our desires, as Christians we know that this is not the case. We do not believe in chance misfortune in life, or in the unlucky nature of our existences. We believe instead that there is a dangerous enemy of sin that makes itself apparent in every corner of our lives. We cannot hope to challenge Satan unprepared, but rather with a dedicated purpose focused on the word of the Lord and his work in our lives. As strategies in war, this mission takes time, takes effort, strength, and willpower. Even with the victory over death already being won, we must strategize against and not be blind to the powerful grip of sin holding us over the fire. Satan is a strategic beast, and he will never hold back. There is hope, but we must be prepared against the attacks of the devil. We must be constantly wary that he will attack us with the skill of timing in our moments of weakness. We must be watchful against the deceptions of the false happiness of sin, and we must adapt to the temptations of the world. This is our mission, to glorify God by fighting the war against sin daily, counteracting the works of the devil with our own careful strategies and relying on God, not physical strength, that we might gain joy through eternal life in Christ and understand that dominance comes through design. Thank you.